everyone. So welcome to today's session. I'll introduce myself and just a little bit of overview and also what today's session's about. So I'm Daren Roett from Elemental Solutions, independent safety health leadership consultant. Quite a vast industry experience, 27 years in safety across a number of organizations globally. And also more recently, the piece of work with the Dorset Explore project, which is something very close to my heart, having started my early career actually looking after young persons on modern apprenticeships. So that's a little bit about me in terms of today. So what we're going to work through with you is really kind of highlights and the key points of any concerns and issues, and really kind of the highlights of what you can do in terms of your knowledge and takeaway around safeguarding in particular, insurance and health and safety, and really is an enabler to remove any kind of concerns or potential hurdles you may foresee currently, and certainly as a takeaway for yourselves today. So I've already covered off a little bit about myself, but the agenda itself overall. So we're going to be looking, as I said, at safeguarding and DBS, insurance considerations. We're going to look at the health and safety arrangements, summary of guidance. We're also going to have an opportunity for some Q&A and also signpost you for additional support needs. There is additional information in these slides. We're not going to be presenting those specifically today, but clearly some takeaways. And in addition to that, there is also a fact sheet takeaway. So all that information will be provided following today's webinar. So I do hope you find this really informative and helpful. As I said, please do start loading in the chat any questions as we progress through. So without further ado, I'll continue. So that's me, as I said. I'm a fortunate picture in respect of how I present myself from a formal safety perspective. But in all honesty, I think safety, as I said, it's a great enabler, and also safety certainly should be something as an organisation, so working at yourselves, for example, it can be something quite, as I say, creative and something that really opens up opportunities as well. Something I strongly believe in. Okay, so a little bit about safeguarding, what you maybe certainly should consider, and certainly in the work experience and young person's work placements. So what are we going to look at today? So there's quite a bit of information on some of these forthcoming slides, but I think important is giving you the highlights of considerations for yourselves in your setting as an organisation. So a little bit about background. So safeguarding young persons relates to persons under 18 years of age, defined legally as children. And what you'll find is primary in terms of the legislation, and what the legislation covers is what's known as regulated and specified activities. Now, typically, what you'll find is these are environments where young persons are involved on a more day-to-day basis. And what I mean by that is environments, for example, teaching, training, instruction. So that's in college, school environments, etc. If there is a core activity, for example, of giving advice and guidance provided primarily aimed at, say, wholly or primarily aimed at children about their educational, emotional, physical well-being, moderating a web service, again, mainly aimed at children, so those young persons, driving a vehicle for children, healthcare or personal care. So I guess what I'm saying here is actually for your awareness is that by definition, the primary regulated and specified activities relate to those I've just mentioned here. I think, and certainly from the point of view of the majority of work experience placement providers, you will likely not fall under the safeguarding rules per se, if you as not operating within a regulated or specified activities. If you are, however, it's likely you already have checks and balances in place, safeguarding arrangements, policies, etc. And also, you see there's some comments here, good to know. So regulated activity. So the reason for the core of regulated activity, it's actually known as an activity where a barred person must not do. So we'll come on to the barring. So it's under DBS actually, so it links into the next topic. But importantly, it's to ensure that we're safeguarding young persons and environments, particularly where it's primarily aimed at in this respect as well. Okay. And also you'll see some links at the bottom of these slides, and there's links also available in the further information that will take you to further guidance, specifically, for example, gov.uk. So this is guidance and activity on what is considered regulated activity to give you some further information as well. So we mentioned DBS checks. So what does that mean? So what are we looking at? So again, you may be familiar, depends on your organization, but to give you a little bit of background and snapshot. So DBS. So it's the Disclosure and Barring Service Checks, so DBS. So what are the requirements? So primarily, and from a DBS, it comes back to the workplace environments. If you think about that regulated activity, working directly with young persons, teaching, support environments, etc., it's typically where DBS checks kick in is the primary one of the primary check requirements. And those checks are looking for is details of convictions and conditional cautions that actually would put the requirements for safeguarding in place. Some of that could be prevention and restricting working with young persons, again, on the background of individuals. And primarily here, there's also some commentary here I'm going to support you on actually as well, and I'm going to get to right now. If you think about it from a workplace perspective, again, back to that regulated activity, it's a general perspective. It's highly unlikely the immediate DBS check requirements will come in. And what I mean by this, for example, if your main purpose of the job, the organizations, your teams and your employees working with you is not actually to supervise, educate, train young persons, you would be sitting outside of the immediate DBS check requirements. There is, however, if you already have a policy, again, if you fall into regulated activity, you already may have these provisions in place. That's absolutely fine. For the Work Explore project, so this is where, for example, the age range is the 11 to 14, so slightly younger age group. These experiences be organised through the schools, and where typically they'll be directly supervised and accompanied from the actual schools themselves. So teaching teams, etc., will actually be accompanying those short visits. So again, what that does actually negates the need for these actually specifics of DBS. Again, but the background might be that already your environment has DBS requirements in place. That's fine, alongside the safeguarding. Again, that final point kind of leans into that. If you already have a pre-existing internal policy, that's absolutely fine. Please do follow it. And they're good to know. Some people say, well, around that regulated activity, etc., what does it actually mean? So the general rule is that if the role works intensively or frequently with with children or vulnerable adults rather, DBS check will be required. So back to that point, there's some strong links and reference points here, particularly if you have any questions or concerns. The DBS telephone helpline can be useful as well. The support links into the websites, the DBS themselves, the Gov website, and also the specifics about us, what the DBS does. Okay, so if you're not familiar, you can have a look, certainly if you're interested. Because in actual fact, there's one other comment, actually, I've not added it here. As an individual, for example, you can request your own basic level DBS check. However, as an employer, you cannot force DBS checks unless you're in a regulated or type environment, a regulated activity, which is something to note as well. Again, it's back to your policies. If you already have them in place, it might be a part of that. So it's all to make sense of that. As I said, these takeaways are here for you to take away after today's session and look a bit more. So linking that together, so safeguarding, DBS, what about other checks and balances? Now we're going to go into a little bit about insurance. Okay. Again, it's about really understanding that is there anything additional, anything new, anything specific, unique for young persons? In reality, most of the times not, because it's an interesting element here, actually, because young persons, particularly on work placements. Now, two things. A young person on a work placement for, let's say, for example, typically a couple of weeks or more, they'd actually be considered under your insurance provision as an employee. Now, your current insurance provision, the Association of British Insurers, as if you have your insurance under a panel, so your provider is part of the ABI or Lloyd's even, you'll almost automatically be insured for working with young persons. Now, there is one caveat to that. The only caveat, which is quite an unusual one, is if you're expecting or wanting the young person to be involved in something different, something outside of your normal routine activity. So that's worth checking with the insurer to make sure you have the right cover, and support in place. Now, the other flip side to this is actually the work explore. So, I mean, more specifically for today as well. So, work explore means, for example, young persons coming accompanied to the workplace, probably for a few hours, they'd actually be treated as visitors, not as employees as such. For example, as the longer work placement, being involved in these sort of day-to-day shadowing and getting involved in work activities. So under the visitor requirements, it's where your public liability insurance kicks in. So what that does, it actually covers for any accidental injury, damage, or to a third party, for example. So typically that's like members of the public, visitors coming to your site. So on the Dorset Explore, the young persons and anyone accompanying them would be considered by under law as actually visitors. And that's where I said your public liability kicks in. One thing I would say, if you're not sure, check your policy document. And also you can make it even quicker by just going back to your insurance provider and say, look, this is our intention. Are we okay? Are we okay to proceed? 9 times out of 10, it's absolutely fine. You've got the right provisions in place. You're covered. Your insurance provision is adequate, supportive of what you need to do. So again, it's just really those checks and balances, for yourselves. This is something you want to check and validate. But typically, as I said, the highlight is that you will have adequate insurance in place for the majority of situations, as long as you're using a provider. Your insurance is covered under the API, which the majority of insurance is, or through Lloyd's of London, just to give you some insight. Okay, so safety and health requirements. So I know from experience, a lot of organizations really do worry about this. Okay, they worry about, can we make it work? The risk of bringing young persons into a workplace from a day-to-day aspect. What are the hurdles? What is it we need to understand? What is it we need to do differently? Now, the good thing is, there's some good news here, is that the guidance from the HSC, the Health and Safety Executive, so the regulators in the UK, is actually been simplified over recent years. And what they're now saying, and it's something I've linked into a website here of guidance from the HSC, is look, keep it simple, but keep it practical, but actually making sure that risks are managed. So what they're saying is the good news is the majority of organizations, your existing safety and health arrangements should be adequate. So, for example, things like risk assessment. Now, there are some pointers around here as well. I'll come on to risk assessment in a moment. But if we start off with the journey of someone coming to your site as a visitor, there are some basic points and actions you need to put in place. So, for example, if you and I a visitor, and it'd be the same for a young person, even on the short visits, for example, the work explore, they may be coming for a few hours, maybe up to a day. It could be, for example. Now, in this respect, they should be treated as visitors. And as a visitor, in most organizations, you'll have some basic arrangements in place. So, for example, making sure the visitors are aware of emergency, fire precautions, assembly routes, etc., what to do in the event of an injury incident, these type of things. These are typically what most organizations already have in place, but make sure you do share that. It's also a really good point of the work explore itself to make people, the young persons, aware of how things are done. How is it that safety is actually managed in your organization, for example? Okay, but also making sure there's arrangements for persons with disabilities, both physical and mental. That's important as well. That's irrespective whether it's a young person coming in to explore your workplace, or whether there's any other visitors in your workplace per se. Also, another point on visitors, please do make sure that you're hosting. This is important for any visitor in your work site or your organization, your office facility, whatever it is. Because hosting is important because people will not be aware of your facilities. There's an extra what we call a duty of care. So it's really important we have that in place as well. So these are kind of key requirements of visitation. Someone coming as a visitor, that short experience, for example, on Work Explore. Now, a little bit more about safety arrangements. There's a lot more detail in here, but I can cut that quite short and navigate for you as well. So I think the importance of that is that, for example, on work experience, something a bit longer. So someone maybe typically a work experience placement could be, let's say, a couple of weeks, for example. Induction. So typically, what you should be following as a minimum is the same type of induction that you would give to a typical new employee coming into your workplace. And that's important, like a day one induction, for example, okay, as per your current organization's, policy, provision, what you already do. Supervision, now this is a critical point. Adequate supervision, particularly for young persons, is really important. I'll explain a little bit more why. Yes, there'll be like other new employees unfamiliar with your workplace, work areas, experience, the actual work area itself and the layout, etc. Young persons should also be considered higher risk for a number of factors. They'll be inexperienced. There's a level of maturity that comes into play. And there's a natural curiosity. Now, from my experience over the years, that experience or lack thereof and the natural curiosity comes into play where supervision is really important. Okay. Because curiosities, people, young persons, for example, might think, what's in this area? What's happening over there? What's happening here? What does that equipment perhaps do? And that's important where, where the supervision is adequate. And the adequate supervision is, think about, again, almost back to that young person piece and a new employee. They don't know your work area. They don't know the provision. They don't know the layouts. So make sure that's adequate. Now, risk assessment. This is where it partly comes into that as well. So what's a risk assessment? So risk assessment is looking at your overall, what we call significant risks. So you'll have, many of you will already have your risk assessments in place, your existing working arrangements, existing tasks, activities. And typically, where you have a current risk assessment, review them. And there's a review aspect, okay? The law does not say you have to have additional risk assessments. So I'll come on to another comment on that in a moment. Particularly make sure you do review your risk assessment before any young person start a work placement. If you do not currently employ young persons, you've not employed a young person in the last few years, you're maybe taking on someone for work experience for the first time, or you're taking on a work experienced student with particular needs. There could be disabilities, other needs, as I say. And risk assessments and findings, in particular including the control measures, must be communicated to the young person so they understand and follow. Because this comes in hand with your supervision, as much as you can, it's making sure that they understand the part of their work experience is they get the full experience of why a risk assessment is important, what they need to follow, what is it that's in place in terms of arrangements to protect them. When we say arrangements, it's control measures. Those control measures could include things like, areas they're not able to move into, walk into, areas where it's restricted in some ways or forms, or equipment they're not able to use as well. And that's another key aspect. In some industrial environments, there are very specific protective measures for young persons, particularly of special hazards. There is additional information slides on this. But think about high risk. It could be exposure to substances in some environments, okay? Or it could be, very hot environments, humid, very cold environments. Again, it's those arrangements you have in place. Another important aspect, again, let's be back to what you already have in standards and policies in place, is things like provision of workwear and PPE. Consider that young persons need to be protected the same way as your existing workforce, the teams of employees you're already working with. Again, so this is a really important factor as well, and just to share with you. So there's some highlights. As I said, there are some additional points. There's a link to the HSC website, a young person's work experience. So they have a particular website area that gives you further guidance as well, which I think would be really useful kind of, sort of asset, to have a read of that as well, as I said, as a takeaway. Okay, so what have we been talking through? I've been talking a lot, and there's a lot to digest, but I think the key points we want to come to is a summary of the guidance points, really. So safeguarding DBS. The rules primarily apply to regulated and specified activities. Additionally, consider any existing organisation policies. Now, certainly if you're in contact with, work with providers, working with schools, etc., there may be some additional needs. But actually, back to that point on risk assessment. Now, in some cases, I do know from experience that through work placements, for example, there may be a request to complete a young person's risk assessment. That may be okay, that's fine. However, use your existing risk assessments to help populate that. You don't have to reinvent the wheel, is what I'm saying. Yeah, just be realistic and make sure that the significant risks are managed and covered. And then there's back to that safeguarding piece. Additionally, consider any existing organisation policies, and that goes right through everything, whether that's safeguarding, the DBS, etc. So check your employers and public liability insurance provision just to make sure. Do a very quick check and balance. Okay, the majority of the times, most organisations, your existing insurance will be pretty adequate in terms of what you need for obviously offering the work explorer and the work placement. Deliver safety inductions, absolute must. We know it's already a must for any team members you already work with, your employees, but make sure it's also in place for those other new young persons coming into the workplace as well. Hosting and supervision, as I said, it's a real paramount point, and making sure that's again adequate in place, and making sure that balance there supporting, because supervision is also about creating an environment where the person can ask questions, get that support they need as well. And back to that risk assessment, check for and review existing risk assessments also. And in particular, if where you've not previously hosted or employed young persons. So that's the highlights in terms of the summary of guidance. And I'll pause there for the moment. I'll hand back for yourself for a moment, Laura.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Daren. And actually, before we end the recording, ready for the Q&A section, I just want to thank you for presenting on actually what can be quite a daunting topic. And you've been able to frame it in such a way where it's much more on what we can do for young people rather than what we can't. Sorry. So thank you very much for that. I also just wanted to highlight, and as you've been able to actually emphasise throughout this presentation, the differences between the sort of Dorset Work Explore and work experiences. So this webinar has been brought to you today by the Dorset Work Explore project. And you can find out more about that on our website, which is dorsetchamber.co.uk/work-explore. So if you want to find out a little bit more, please go on there and visit, or reach out to myself and Rosie, and we'd be really happy to have a chat. But also, I just wanted to kind of let people know that this project is being delivered by Dorset Chamber. It's being funded by Dorset Careers Hub and the Careers and Enterprise Company. So massive thank you there. So without them, this wouldn't be able to take place. And we're doing it in partnership with Dorset Council as well. So I just really wanted to give a massive thank you to all of our partners. So for those of you that are watching this as a recording, thank you very much for joining. And for those of you that are watching it live, please stick around and we'll get on to the Q&As, but I'll just stop the recording first.